For those of you that don't know me, my name is Shelby Mitchell. I am the mental health counselor for the Columbus State, Delaware campus. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how to tackle test anxiety. So what to do when you have that, when you're feeling anxious about taking a test. We're going to talk about some strategies. Oops, let me go forward here. There we go. So we're going to learn to identify and recognize anxiety symptoms and warning signs within yourself, learn the difference between anxiety and anxiety disorders. We're going to discuss some steps for overcoming test anxiety, and then we're going to talk about some resources for managing your anxiety. So what is anxiety? We use anxiety as kind of a catch-all for everything nowadays. So we say in terms of stress. We use anxiety as a way to describe just feeling generally stressed. We use anxiety for those butterflies in your stomach that you get sometimes. But really what anxiety is the mind and body's reaction to a stressful, dangerous, or unfamiliar situation. So what's important to keep in mind, this can be real or perceived. This does not necessarily have to be something that is attacking you physically, although that is where anxiety comes from. It is our body's way of protecting us. And so this is a real or perceived threat. The problem is, and we'll get into this a little bit later, your body and your brain don't know the difference between real and perceived threats. So for test anxiety, for instance, your body and your brain are going to react the same way as if you were, for instance, running from a bear. So it's going to do the same thing in both situations. So basically what happens is your body releases hormones, causes a variety of symptoms. It's all getting ready for that fight, flight, or freeze mode in order to protect you from whatever stimuli is making your body feel and your brain feel threatened. So it's really important to note that everybody's experience is very unique. There is no one size fits all for what anxiety looks like. There's also not one size fits all for how to treat anxiety. And so it's important that we're recognizing that one person that has anxiety might not look the same as, what your anxiety might look like. And it's also important to remember that everybody has butterflies at test time, right? That's actually a healthy thing, which we'll get into. It's normal to be a little bit anxious. It's normal to be a little bit stressed, but test anxiety in and of itself is so much more. So it really encapsulates students that are fully prepared to take these tests. However, they sit down for the test, their mind goes totally blank, and that is due to the overwhelming stress that causes them to no longer be able to think clearly. Now, today's environment has really put a microscope on anxiety because anxiety rates have skyrocketed since the pandemic hit. So the prevalence of anxiety nowadays is about 3 times higher than it was before the pandemic. And so if you're somebody that used to not really experience anxiety and now you're recognizing that with the pandemic that you've been experiencing a little bit more anxiety than usual, that is pretty common across the board. Not that that's a good thing, but it's something to note that the pandemic has really increased isolation. We're going through a lot of changes, even still, now that we're looking at things opening back up and getting back to a sense of normalcy. We start to experience this concept called change fatigue. And so because of that, we start to experience an increase in anxiety of not knowing what's coming. What are things going to look like? On top of that, working with this new technology. And I know that by now we're about a year in and we're a little bit better with all the technology that we've got nowadays. But it's still, there's always, things that pop up that are frustrating. And just all of the uncertainty has caused skyrocketing anxiety rates, which means that if you are experiencing anxiety, even just, a little bit higher anxiety than normal, test anxiety is definitely something that you might see increasing as well. So it's important that we're having these conversations so that we learn what to look for, how to recognize it in ourselves, and then also what we can actually do about it. And it's also really important to keep in mind that anxiety has actually surpassed depression. So depression used to be the most common mental health diagnosis among college students, but now anxiety is, according to a 2017 nationwide survey. So that is, we're seeing anxiety rates just continue to increase, both with the pandemic and just in general. So talking about test anxiety specifically, some triggers, some things that we notice that might cause test anxiety. Cognitively, we might see like fear of failure, or lack of preparation, just negative thought patterns in general, comparing yourself to other people. Behaviorally, we might see poor test history, poor time management, poor study habits, worrying about your performance, and then past experiences. So those might be some of the triggers. And then the symptoms from that you might notice that really are present when we're experiencing anxiety are headaches, stomach aches, nausea, excessive sweating, shortness of breath. Those are all those physical ones. Cognitively or emotionally, we might start to notice that we're having some low self-esteem. We might notice some depression, anger, hopelessness. Irritability is a really big one. Anxiety often presents itself as irritability, but we don't always notice it. We just see that we're more irritable with people and we're not really sure why. And then more of the behavioral, we see, poor concentration or going blank, being confused frequently, forgetting things is a really big one, and difficulty focusing. So is it normal anxiety or an anxiety disorder? This is important because, like I said in the beginning, we using the word anxiety to sort of encapsulate all of the symptoms that we might experience with even normal stress or frustration. And so normal anxiety is related to a specific situation or problem. So like I said, when you get a little nervous for a test or maybe a little anxious on a test, that's okay. That's normal. And it usually only lasts as long as the situation or the problem lasts. So if, again, you're feeling a little anxious about a test, you're going into the test, you're feeling a little anxious about it, you're taking the test, you're able to get through it, and then afterwards, the anxiety goes away. It's proportional to the situation or problem, so it's not so big that it's causing us like panic attacks or anything like that, and it's a realistic response to a realistic problem. Now, the way that that's different from anxiety is anxiety may come up totally unexpectedly, or for seemingly no reason. That's usually what we see with generalized anxiety, which we'll talk about. The anxiety response may be much stronger than expected. And so when I say that, really what I mean is if you are feeling anxious about a test, it's more than just those butterflies that I described, or it's more than just this general feeling of stress, but it's something so much bigger where we're talking about full-blown panic attacks. And when we're seeing those really strong reactions, that is outside of the realm of what a typical response to a situation like that might be. Experiencing unrealistic anxiety, such as fear of a situation that will likely never happen. So I use this example a lot of feeling like if you fail this one test, all of a sudden you're gonna, it's gonna snowball and you're gonna fail the entire course and you're gonna fail out of school and you're not gonna get a job. Like snowballing so big that it turns into your entire future is jeopardized by this one test. It lasts for a really long time, even when the problem has resolved. So even after the test, we continue to feel that anxiety and stress. It feels impossible to control or manage, and then avoiding situations or things they believe to be triggering their anxiety symptoms. So some types of anxiety we might notice that students face. Generalized anxiety, so excessive worry in many areas. So this is the most common anxiety diagnosis, but basically this is just we are anxious about, I mentioned, we're not even really sure why we're anxious, but we're worried in a variety of situations. And so that is generally where we're seeing that generalized anxiety disorder. And then we have phobias. So specific phobias are extreme fears of a situation that is out of the proportion for a normal fear or reaction to a perceived threat. A lot of times we see this with like heights, spiders, and other animals, things like that. Then we have panic disorder, which is an extreme response to anxiety where a person experiences a panic attack. And they may experience multiple physical symptoms that are overwhelming and debilitating. And most of the time when this happens, students might feel like they're having like a heart attack. And so when we're saying extreme test anxiety, we're most likely to fall under that category of phobia or panic, just depending on what symptoms are being presented with. Generalized anxiety is a lot more general, not to say that we don't see test anxiety with generalized anxiety. And also keeping in mind that test anxiety in and of itself is not a diagnosis, so it would just, the symptoms would fall under one of these three categories. So it's pretty prevalent. It's estimated that about 16% of college and high school students have high test anxiety, and 18% have moderately high test anxiety. When we're thinking about numbers of that, to give you context, we're seeing that like depression impacts about 1 in 5 people. So that's almost on par with the rates of depression that we're seeing, and that's, you know, general across the United States. But that's a high number when we're thinking about it from a pure number standpoint. We're talking millions of students, so it's much higher than we might recognize, and it's definitely something that we need to learn to control. Now, obviously, anxiety is not always bad. It's there for a reason. We developed this anxiety within ourselves, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago in order to keep ourselves safe. And so having some levels of anxiety, it's good for us, whether it is actually keeping ourselves safe or it's just to kind of help us be motivated. It's all right to feel a little bit anxious and stressed. And so when you look at the graph down there, if we have absolutely no stress about something, then we actually are really bored, we're inactive, we're not motivated. And if we're on the other side where we're so stressed, we can no longer function. We're so mentally exhausted. We might be having those panic attacks. We're breaking down. And so both sides of that spectrum are really unhealthy. We want to find ourselves somewhere in the middle where we're seeing that peak performance, where we're feeling a little bit stressed, but we're able to focus because we're motivated and passionate about it. And so we want to make sure that we're not so far on one side where our anxiety is taking over to the point where we can't think anymore. We're turning off that part of our brain that we need for taking tests or focusing in school. So we don't want to be over there, but we also don't want to be so low that we don't even have motivation to study or get anything done. However, there are times when anxiety is not helpful, right? So this is called the anxiety cycle. So it starts off with feeling a little bit anxious about something. We feel that those physical feelings of uncomfortability, such as like a racing heart, we're sweating, we get those butterflies in our stomach, we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed or a little fearful. And then because of that anxiety, our natural reaction, you might have heard me mention the fight, flight, or freeze mode that we have in our brain. That is something that we've developed, again, thousands of years ago in order to keep ourselves safe. So some people, when they feel anxious, run away. That's that flight, or freeze. And so in those situations, we might feel this instinct to avoid, because our brain is telling us, I don't want to be put in a situation that's making me feel uncomfortable, so I need to avoid it. That's our survival mechanism. And so these uncomfortable situations are controlled by avoiding this anxiety-producing situation in order, again, to protect us. So this might include like skipping the studying that we need to do so that we're avoiding the stress, using drugs or alcohol to numb your feelings, procrastinating on challenging tasks. And so all of that then leads to this short-term relief from anxiety, which in the moment feels good, right? We're avoiding studying for this test because we're saying that's too much anxiety, or we're procrastinating doing this paper because we're like, nope, it's just causing me too much stress. And then we avoid it for a short period of time and we're like, oh, cool, I don't have to think about it. It feels good. The problem is that it then turns to long-term anxiety growth. That basically the avoidance worsens, the anxiety increases. As a result, we are going to experience more anxiety in the long run than we would have if we would have done that thing and not avoided it. And so basically the brain learns that when the anxiety producing situation is avoided, the symptoms go away. So this cycle just continues over and over and over again. And so then when something happens in the future, when we're feeling anxious, the brain has now associated, oh, I feel anxious, I need to avoid this situation because I can't be in that. So we're more likely to avoid in the future. So it's important that we're starting to identify some different ways that you can manage anxiety. And so identifying the triggers and the red flags are going to be really, really big. What are some of the things that make you anxious? If you know that writing certain papers or taking certain tests increase your anxiety, what can you do about that? Sometimes it's just simply recognizing it. I often encourage my students to ask themselves why. It's really easy when we are in anxiety to not even really know why we're feeling anxious. We might have those butterflies in our stomach just when we're driving and we're like, can't even identify what's going on as to make us feel that way. And so it's important that we're asking ourselves why. Where is this coming from? And then asking yourself too, if you are worried about this test coming up, okay, what is it about the test coming up that is causing you anxiety? Is it that you're worried about getting a bad grade? Are you worrying about letting family members down or letting your friends down? Are you worrying about money? Like where is it that is coming into play? What is the root cause of the anxiety? If we don't know the root cause, then it makes step 2 really difficult to problem solve ways to make it better. So if we're not really sure what it is that we're feeling anxious about, like maybe the root cause is that we have poor test history, poor test taking history, which is causing the anxiety to increase. If we can't identify that, then we aren't even going to know that maybe we need to get a tutor or learn different study habits. But if we can figure out the triggers, if we can figure out the root cause of the anxiety, then it makes the problem solving a lot easier. So maybe identifying different ways that you can study, getting a tutor, finding a different location to work on things. I think that is especially helpful right now. Being in quarantine as we have for so long and working and living and doing school from home, everybody is feeling very cooped up, and our home life has now turned into our personal life and our work life and our school life, and everything is meshing together and getting really blurry. And so if you're working from your bedroom, for instance, your brain has associated your bedroom with sleep because that's where we go to bed. Which is fine, but when we're trying to study in there, it's not usually the most helpful. So it's important that we're maybe finding a different location that we can go to work on things, whether it's your community library, popping some headphones in and working at like a Starbucks, but trying a different location to work on assignments so that your brain does not associate where you are with your personal life, that it's able to focus. Identifying other skills that you've utilized for managing symptoms and build upon those skills. So if you know that there is something in the past that has worked really well in helping you manage test anxiety, or if there's something that's helped you take tests better, use those and then build upon them. It's really important that that sort of becomes our first step. A lot of times the students that I work with forget that they have the skills to work through whatever it is that they're struggling with. They just need to identify them. And so sometimes it's about identifying the skills that have worked in the past in order to then build on them a little bit and tweak them. Especially, thinking back to like high school, for instance. If you never really experienced test anxiety in high school, were there things that helped you manage it back then? And remembering that each person is so different, and so individualized skills are really, really important. Like what works for your friend might not work for you, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that anything is wrong. It just means that our needs are different. And then if those two steps don't work so well, we got to ask for help. Allowing others to know anxiety struggles can remove the sensation of isolation. There are anxiety support groups that could be really helpful to participate in, just to get perspective from other people of what's going on, how you're feeling, and getting that sense of community can help us not feel so alone. And then if you're unable to identify any skills at all, it's helpful to seek support, whether it's from a therapist, maybe from somebody else in your life, just to make sure that you're getting a different perspective for how you can manage your anxiety in these situations. So before the exam, if you're feeling anxious, making sure that you're getting a good night's sleep for several days before the exam. This is one that I do not hear enough from the students that I work with. We so often feel like we need to stay up really, really late to do well and study and do all of the things. And the problem is that by doing that, you're actually impairing your ability to succeed on the exam, in the coming days. So basically what happens is if you're not getting a good night's sleep, your brain kind of goes into that survival mode again. It goes into overdrive to keep you alive. And so if we're pulling all-nighters or if we're staying up super, super late, the things that you just put in your brain, they're not going to be stored into long-term memory. So we're not allowing ourselves to fall into that deep sleep that stores things in long-term memory. So making sure that you're getting a good night's sleep is absolutely vital. And basically understanding that staying up really late is not going to help you retain more information. It's important to make sure that you're eating and drinking healthily, and that is on the day of the test as well as leading up to tests. High anxiety can increase the impact of caffeine, for instance, so trying to reduce caffeine intake the day of exams or energy drinks. Same with sugary drinks that can spike your blood pressure and make you crash during the test. All of these are very physical and biological. And when we're thinking about that, our biology is going to take over more than our cognitive motivation. Like if we're sitting there saying like, just do it, I just need to focus. Like your body is going to take over more than you really want to be motivated. Understandably, if you want to push through and just tell yourself that you need to focus and it's going to be okay, but your body and your brain don't really care about what you want. They're going to force you to protect yourself in one way or another. And so we might notice that our body and our brain are kind of crashing during tests, or we're having even severe anxiety while we're taking exams because of caffeine or sugary drinks. You don't really get a say over that. So making sure we're being kind to our body and drinking a lot of water and things that make us feel good. Studying early instead of cramming, and making sure that you're taking breaks instead of studying all at once. And this goes back a little bit to the sleep aspect of things. So after a certain amount of time, our brain is no longer retaining information that we put into it. So it's usually about 30 to 45 minutes is our capacity for how long we can focus on one thing. So if we are spending hours and hours and hours studying for some test that we have, you're actually less likely to remember what you just read. So if you've ever sat there and you've read something over and over and over again, that's kind of a red flag for you to know my brain is done. It's hit its limit, it's hit its capacity. I need to take a break and walk away. Talk to your professor to find out what sort of information will be on the test and how best you can prepare. This is another really important one. Obviously, it's understandable that they're not going to give us the test answers. They're not going to give us all the information. And it's okay to be honest with your professors and saying, I'm feeling a little bit anxious. I have some test anxiety. I'm just wondering what you think would be helpful for me in this test specifically. Will it be all multiple choice? Will there be some, extended answers? And just trying to get information that can help you prepare and feel a little bit more in control. And maybe trying to get some exercise on the day of the exam. What we know is that exercise releases dopamine and serotonin. It elicits feelings of relaxation when we're done and accomplishment. It really seriously reduces anxiety. So if we're able to exercise, that's always a really good technique if you feel that you're able to do so. So talking a little bit about, now this goes with day of the exam, before the exam, during the exam, all the time. This is a technique that can apply when it comes to anxiety or just negative thinking in general. We all have negative thoughts. That's part of being a human being. It's totally normal. We call them cognitive distortions. These are those thoughts that pop into your head that really we're thinking all day long. So these thoughts pop into our head. We don't even give ourselves a chance to challenge them in any way whatsoever. But those negative thoughts that are popping into your head that say, I can't do this, it's so instantaneous. And then those elicit negative feelings. So that's where we start to feel anxious, irritable, frustrated, sad, whatever emotions go along with the negative thoughts that you just had, which then lead to unwanted behaviors, which are the avoidance behaviors, or maybe we lash out at people, or maybe we are fighting more often. So recognizing that all three of those things, your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors, are very connected. Now, it's a lot easier to start with your thoughts, challenging those thoughts. It might sound easy by the way that I'm about to describe it, but it's hard. It's easier said than done, but it's also really important that we're challenging those thoughts. So when I say that our thoughts pop into our head instantaneously, it's important that we're stopping and questioning, asking yourself, what evidence do I have for this thought? Putting your thoughts on trial a little bit. And really saying, okay, I'm saying I can't do this, or I'm not smart enough. What evidence do I have to support that? And then we go through the list of evidence. Well, I got a bad grade on this test one time. Math is not my favorite subject. Like trying to go through all of the evidence that you can find that supports the thought that you just had. But then to counter it, we have to also recognize what what evidence is against the thought that we just had. So if you have that thought of, I'm not smart enough, but you've gotten this far, there's no way to get this far without having some sort of intelligence. Also recognizing that you've taken tests before that were just fine. So trying to go through the list of evidence for and against your thought and really putting your thoughts on trial. I encourage students to think about it as if you were actually in court. We don't walk into a court system and say, hey, I have a gut feeling that this person is guilty. And then all of a sudden the jury's like, okay, sounds legitimate. Let's go ahead and convict him. That is absolutely not how our justice system works. And so we want to be mindful that in order to convict somebody of anything, we have to have evidence. And the moment that you start finding yourself saying, but I feel this way, that's no longer evidence. Feelings are not facts. They're not evidence. So we have to be very mindful of what evidence truly is. What is the actual evidence that you are not going to do well on this test? And really being very, very specific with it. And then the next step on that cognitive triangle is exploring your emotions. So increasing your emotional vocabulary. We call this name it to tame it. So naming what emotions you might have that lie below the surface of that initially identified emotion. More often than not, you can kind of think about it actually like an iceberg. We show such a small portion of the emotion that we're actually feeling. And more often than not, it comes across as irritability or annoyance or frustration. And if we dig a little bit deeper and say, what's actually going on underneath the surface? Maybe we're feeling some disappointment. Maybe we're feeling insecurity or vulnerability. And if we're able to identify those underlying emotions, we can actually make some changes because those underlying emotions might be leading to this anxiety that we're experiencing about the current situation. And if we're just attacking the situation at hand and saying, well, I just need to take care of this that's happening to me right now, it's a lot less likely that we're going to create sustained long-term change. So identifying the underlying feelings, if we're going to go with the example of insecurity or vulnerability, if we can actually address those emotions rather than addressing the frustration that we're putting out, then we're going to experience some actual long-term change by addressing those underlying feelings. And then the last aspect of this would be changing behaviors. So practicing actual skills that can help you control behaviors that you might be experiencing. So if we go with avoidance, for instance, practicing techniques to avoid your avoidance, but to not avoid situations that are making you feel anxious by practicing, different relaxation techniques, deep breathing exercises, crisis survival skills to help you feel in control during anxiety-provoking situations rather than your anxiety controlling you. So some more cognitive tips for reducing test anxiety. So making sure that we're putting things in perspective. Reminding yourself, yes, this exam is important. We're not going to minimize that. It's important that we recognize that you're okay to feel anxious about this test that's coming up, but your entire future does not depend on this one exam. There's a lot more that goes into passing or failing or dropping out or getting a job and all of that than just this one exam that is coming up. And so making sure that we're keeping that in perspective. This goes along with the evidence-based practice that we are saying, hey, I've had past successes where I've done really well on exams. I didn't get this far without doing well on some exam at some point. And so being mindful of the past successes that you've had. Not giving the test the power to define you. So at the end of the day, your test doesn't tell you really how smart you are. It also doesn't tell you who the most or least intelligent person in your class is. This is a very small aspect of what we deem to be intelligence, right? And I always talk about the crazy, crazy smart people in this world that never even graduated college. And so not letting the test or even sometimes aspects of school define who we are or our character, because that is not everything that goes into being a good or bad person or even being a successful person. And so really recognizing that your performance on any exam depends on how well you've studied, not who you are as a person, not your quality of character. So making sure that we're keeping that in perspective. A tip that you can use is visualizing yourself completing the test successfully despite your anxiety. So kind of running it through like a movie in your head from the moment you wake up that day all the way until when you finish the exam. And so trying to walk yourself through, if some anxiety pops up, what do I do? How can I control it? And so giving yourself the ability to practice all of those things prior to going into the exam. Reminding yourself that a certain level of anxiety is normal and actually helpful and healthy in helping you perform the best that you can on a test. Remembering that we do not want to be so calm that we don't care. We need to have a level of stress going into an exam in order to perform to the best of our ability. And reminding yourself that you don't know all the material that could possibly appear on the test, and nobody else does either. It's just not possible unless you have an absolute photographic memory. But remembering that it's just not possible to have every single answer for the test and that we're not going to get everything right. It's just not possible to be perfect. And in those situations, I would say using self-compassion, which I think we get into on the next slide. But self-compassion is a really, really important skill to use both during, before, all the time. It is an important skill that we should all be learning. We are so much harder on ourselves than anybody else in our life. We're sometimes harder on ourselves than we are our worst enemy. And so making sure that we're recognizing that we need to treat ourselves like we would a friend. If you saw a friend struggling and, saying, oh my God, I'm going to fail this test, you would never sit there and be like, yeah, you're probably right, you're going to fail it. We would never say that to a friend. And so making sure we're treating ourselves like we would somebody that we care about. There's no reason as to why we shouldn't. We have such a backwards way of viewing success in our society that we think that in order to be successful, you have to be really hard on yourself. And what we might not recognize is the complete opposite is actually true. So in order to be successful, we have to engage a level of self-compassion. When we are hard on ourselves or we use negative self-talk, our brain actually goes into that fight, flight, or freeze mode and goes into the survival mode, which, like we kind of talked about before, when you're in survival mode, you turn off the front part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that is vital for learning and memory and rational thought. So if we don't have access to that, how are we supposed to be successful? So it's a very backwards way of viewing things. If we're actually kind to ourselves and we engage in self-compassion and saying, I'm a human being, I'm not going to get it perfect, and that's okay, we're more likely to succeed. Ways that you can manage your anxiety during an exam. So trying some progressive muscle relaxation or other relaxation techniques. This one specifically goes into tightening and relaxing muscles, going through one by one, each muscle in your body, tightening it up, focusing on what it feels to be tight, and then allowing it to relax and focusing on that feeling of relaxation. So this is a technique that you can pretty much, all of these are techniques that you can pretty much try anytime. So if our body doesn't know the feeling of calm, it's going to be really difficult to allow ourselves to feel calm when we need it. So practicing progressive muscle relaxation, even outside of taking exams or being involved in something school related, in order to give your body that feeling of relaxation. This is a really good technique that you can use when trying to fall asleep at night. And there are plenty of like apps and YouTube videos that you can search for that will walk you through how to do progressive muscle relaxation, as well as deep breathing skills, guided imagery, grounding skills, all of those things. So deep breathing skills are also very, very important. Our breathing is our brain's pace clock. So if you sit here and start hyperventilating, your brain is going to think that it needs to be feeling stressed in some way, and it's going to throw you into probably a full-blown panic attack. And so making sure that we're using deep breathing skills to control the level of oxygen that our brain is getting, control the feeling of anxiety, deep breathing skills are very underrated and also very, very important. Using compassionate self-talk, like I had mentioned on the last slide. Using mindfulness or grounding techniques. So if you notice that your brain is starting to kind of wander and you're starting to feel a little bit anxious, you're starting to find your thoughts go kind of reeling and going through all of these different what if scenarios, stopping yourself and using a mindfulness or grounding technique. And so what this can look like is I use the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. Identifying 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and the taste in your mouth. And so doing that is important because our 5 senses are directly linked to our brain. And so when our brain is going into that fight, flight, or freeze mode and it's going into survival mode and we're turning off that prefrontal cortex, mindfulness allows us to calm our body and our brain down, regain access to our rational thoughts, regain access to our prefrontal cortex, and get back to a place that we need to in order to take a test successfully. Cognitive restructuring or thought stopping, that's a little bit of what we talked about a couple slides ago on challenging our thoughts and trying to put our thoughts on trial, finding the evidence for and against our thoughts. And then on top of that, so after you've found the evidence, the cognitive restructuring goes to finding a little bit more of a neutral way of addressing the situation. Rather than saying, I'm going to fail, or this is going to be the best test I've ever had, those are really two opposite sides of the spectrum. We want to be somewhere in the middle where it's a little bit more neutral and a little bit more realistic. We say, I don't exactly know how this test is going to go, but I do know that whatever ends up happening, I'm going to problem solve it, I'm going to work it out, and it's going to be all right. And trying to really walk yourself through in a more rational and realistic way rather than going the complete opposite side of the spectrum of saying, it's going to be perfect and I'm going to be great, because that's false and toxic positivity. Taking breaks when you're able to, when you're feeling anxious. This would be something really good to, again, talk with your teachers about ahead of time, helping them understand that you feel test anxiety and that you really struggle while taking tests and you might need to take a break, that you have no problem like leaving your phone in the classroom, but it's really important that you walk away for a second. Obviously, this makes more sense when we're in person. When we're virtually, not exactly the same. You can kind of take breaks whenever you might need to, but making sure you're taking breaks when you're feeling anxious. And using good test taking skills. Read the directions carefully. Budget your time, work at a comfortable pace, start with your easier questions, and then return to ones that you might have skipped, trying to stay focused using the techniques that we just talked about and rechecking your answers if you have time. So making sure that you're preparing ahead of time for how you're going to approach the exam so that while you're in the exam, you know exactly what you need to do. So talking a little bit about the importance of relaxation, like I mentioned before. So the stress that we experience has this really serious physical impact on our bodies, and it sometimes has a long-term impact on our bodies. If we get so used to feeling anxious in our everyday life, our body and our brains start to think that we need to feel this way all the time. And it kicks up that adrenaline so that we are all of a sudden feeling anxious when we don't even know why we're feeling anxious. And so making sure that we're practicing relaxation techniques as much as we possibly can in order to give our body this sense of calm. It helps us to limit our reactions to those perceived or real physical threats, to think rationally about what we need to do in those situations. So taking deep breaths, like I mentioned, can force our body to relax, which decreases stress. And decreasing stress helps us to both feel better physically and mentally. On the right there, that talks just a little bit about the fight, flight, or freeze response that we have in our brain that I've mentioned multiple times. So essentially, like I mentioned before, when we're faced with a life-threatening danger, it makes sense that we need to run away, freeze, or fight. And so that is automatic. It is not something that we have to think about. Our body kicks in this response in order to protect ourselves. And so basically what happens is, all of the things that you might notice on that graph there, but, we get those butterflies, we get our heart pounding faster because we're pumping blood to our essential organs in order to prepare to run away or to fight, to protect ourselves. Our breathing becomes quicker. We take in more oxygen so that we can power our muscles. You might even feel a little bit dizzy, like you're going to pass out, but that only happens when we experience that was my dog. When we experience a decrease in blood pressure, and when you are feeling anxious or stressed, you actually experience increase in blood pressure. So you do not pass out from having that fight, flight, or freeze mode or feeling anxious. And it's important that we're finding a supportive community, like I mentioned before. Where have you found a sense of community? Do you feel like there's anywhere that you can go to talk to somebody, whether it's a group of people, whether it's your friends, or maybe it's just talking to a therapist, but finding support that you can have to help you feel that you're not alone in this feeling of anxiety that you're having, whether it's general or whether it's just test related. There are also some really good communities on campus, like through Columbus State, that you can utilize. So student engagement and leadership, global diversity and inclusion, employment, faith-based communities, and then obviously your family and friends. So if you feel like you need to expand your community in some way, there's also a lot of really helpful groups right now that are virtual that pretty much anybody can attend. Not necessarily through Columbus State. We have had some anxiety groups in the past, so keep an eye out for those because we might be running some again in the future. But just online in general, there are some really helpful community groups that you can connect with other people that might be feeling the same way. And there's also forums online. So there's a really helpful app called Sanvello. I recommend this app to my students a lot because this is an app that you can, it kind of has it all. It helps you go through cognitive restructuring, relaxation techniques, things like that. But it also has a community page where you can connect with other people that are struggling with whatever you might be struggling with. They have school anxiety on there. I don't know specifically about test anxiety, but depression, LGBTQ issues, whatever might be coming up, there's a lot of opportunities on there to connect with people that are struggling with something similar. And making sure that we know how to help other people. So if somebody is expressing a problem, making sure that you're listening in a very empathetic way. It is really important that when we're listening to somebody that's struggling, we're empathetic and we're open-minded. It's most of the time people just want to be validated. They don't want to hear an immediate response. They don't want to hear a problem-solving technique right off the bat. They just want somebody to sit there and say, that's awful. I can't imagine how hard that must be for you. And also recognizing that just because you do something and it works for you doesn't mean that it's automatically going to work for other people. And so we've got to be very mindful of recognizing that because we tell somebody something doesn't mean it's going to be perceived as helpful. Asking the person if you feel comfortable doing so, if they're suicidal, depending on their level of anxiety or distress. If their answer is yes, and they are feeling suicidal and you're concerned about somebody, please refer them to counseling services, refer them to the suicide prevention hotlines. There's a lot of really good ones. In Delaware, there is a specific suicide prevention hotline called Helpline. Columbus State, actually, we have our own app called Hope and Help. So that's a really good app to access. It helps to, there's all the crisis intervention lines on there, or you could just go to your nearest emergency room. They will always do an assessment if you feel like you want to talk to somebody and get assessed for what's going on, or you want a friend too. And when our skills aren't enough and they're just not working, we can resort to outpatient therapy. So this is a really good technique, for talking with somebody. They can, a therapist can help you identify some of those triggers, those red flags, those warning signs, developing some skills that can help you manage all of those things. Medication is also a really good technique in conjunction to outpatient therapy. I don't generally recommend medication management in and of itself. Yes, it can be helpful, but it's not going to fix the problem. The anxiety is still going to be there. And if we are only using medication to manage our anxiety, then we're not actually learning anything. We're not addressing the problem itself. We're just masking it. And so medication can help us be a little bit more stable and maybe get some medication that will help in the moment. But it's also really important that we're learning skills in conjunction with that. And exposure therapy is something that helps a lot with anxiety-provoking situations, and this is done within outpatient therapy. These are some good resources. So I mentioned on here, we have counseling services, both for the downtown and Delaware campus. We have the Hope and Help app here, student advocacy, the suicide prevention hotline. So take all of this for what you might need. On the right side, I have a couple apps that I've helped students have access to that are really, really helpful. So Stop, Breathe, Think, Headspace, and Calm are good ones. I mentioned earlier Sanvello, that's spelled Sanvello. So those are all fabulous apps that you can use to help manage anxiety, whether it's accessing a relaxation technique or if it's just helpful to be able to go in and journal. There are some really good journaling apps in there too. All right, so are there any questions? You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask any questions you might have. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen here, I think. There we go. All right.
It looks like Adil might be typing a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Says, if I've been studying for a long time, is it helpful to study before a test day? Yeah, absolutely. So like if you've been studying for days and you feel like pretty prepared, it's still okay to study the day before a test, I think is what you're asking. Yeah, I mean, I don't want you guys to take from this that you shouldn't overstudy or if you feel like you've studied enough that you shouldn't continue studying, that's okay. We just want to be mindful of how long we're studying and what we're sacrificing while we're studying. So if you are studying excessively and you're losing sleep because of it, or you're neglecting your basic needs like eating and like basic everyday functions, then it's too much. But we can still continue studying even if, it's the day before a test or even sometimes on test day. You can study if you feel like you need to, but I would again limit it as much as you can to about 30 to 45 minutes, and then taking a break, going and rewarding yourself with something that you enjoy, whether that is, going for a walk or getting something to eat that you like, whatever that might be. And then going back to studying when you have a clear and fresh mind. And Jason said, what is it that you said you can do on the Sanvello app again? So Sanvello that app is really awesome. So it allows you to go through the process, like step-by-step process of the cognitive restructuring that I mentioned. So you take a thought and you identify which cognitive distortion it is. It gives you a list of the different cognitive distortions. And so you can say, if you have this thought of, I'm not good enough, it gives you all these different options of cognitive distortions. And just so you guys know, cognitive distortions are thoughts that we have that are inaccurate, that basically are unrealistic or irrational, that we struggle to recognize that are unrealistic and irrational. And so it allows you to pick which cognitive distortion, and then it forces you to go through and say, how can I look at this a little bit more realistically? And so it really walks you through step by step how to do that. That's one aspect. It also allows you to do some like mood tracking. It allows you to do some journaling. It has the community aspect where you can engage with other, like their community boards, where you can engage with other people that are struggling with similar things. So typing through, and talking with other people that are struggling, whether that's with school stress, anxiety, depression, whatever it may be. And then there's also some relaxation techniques on there. So it's a pretty extensive app. There's a lot of really fabulous aspects to it. So I would encourage you guys to check it out. Any other questions? And then if all else fails, counseling services is here. We talk with a lot of students that struggle with test anxiety, and it's absolutely no problem at all to reach out to somebody and get some extra tools. I always say we cannot possibly know everything. It's just not possible. So it's all right to get some help from other people that may be able to provide you with some skills that you have not tried before.